DiscerningHearts.com presents Hope in Difficult Times with St. Therese and her family with Father Timothy Gallagher. This series of programs is a special presentation of the retreat conducted by Father Timothy Gallagher, which features the lives of St. Therese of Lisieux, Saints Louis and Zelie Martin, servant of God Leonie Martin, and the entire Martin family. We now begin Conference 3.
So we'll pick right up with where we were yesterday. And we're looking obviously at the letters of Zelie. This is the room where Zelie wrote those letters. That's preserved in the family home, which pilgrims can visit. And you see her desk over in the corner. And and Louis at times would do his work here on the table. And you can imagine, you can imagine her in those late hours of the evening, sitting at that desk, writing those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-page letters that we're reading. Let's see. All right, just to get the chronology. So we're in the year 1869 here, leading up toward that Franco-Prussian War. And in this year, in April, Celine is born. Celine, who is the 7th of the children. And she will become the great confidant of Thérèse and be very important in Thérèse's story. She will also take care of their father in his final illness. And this is Helene. It's the one picture that we have of her. And people, as I say, I've said many times now, everyone loved her. You can see the family look there. You can see Zelie's look there in her, as you can in others, and the other daughters. This is 10 months after the birth of Celine that Helene dies. And she dies at 5 years. Now, we went through the letters leading up to and after the death of the second of the boys, Joseph Jean-Baptiste. I'm not going to go through all the letters of each of the death of the children, but you can extrapolate from what we saw, what the death of that second boy meant for Zelie, and understand what this meant. I'm just giving one sentence from a letter where she writes to her brother Isidore and his wife Celine after the death of Helene. I'm resigning myself to the will of God, though it's very hard to lose such a pretty girl. And this is the third of the deaths in the family. And then 6 months later, her 8th child is born. And this is Melanie Teres. And this is the, I've been showing bits of this, but this is something that Thérèse put together in remembrance of the 4 brothers and sisters that she lost at an early age. And there you see Helene. There is no photograph of, okay, I'll just give you the names: Joseph Louis, Joseph Jean-Baptiste, Helene, and now the last one, who is Melanie Teres. And you'll notice that Thérèse doesn't give any photograph here, and the reason she doesn't is that there was no photograph taken of this child. She didn't live long enough. So she is born on August 16th. We're in the year 1870 now. And she dies 7 weeks later on October 8th. And this is the final of the deaths of these children. And this one was a very difficult one for Zelie, because again, she couldn't nurse the child herself, and so they had to find a wet nurse for her. And it was always a struggle. Rose, they knew, was trustworthy, but she was 6 miles away. And in this case, they found one right in Alençon, so they could visit the child frequently. But this wet nurse was not trustworthy. There was alcohol involved in this, and essentially the child died from neglect. So Marie writes about this. Marie, as a young girl, together with the maid, they would go frequently to visit the home where Melanie Teres was living with the wet nurse. And she wrote this: "I didn't find that she, the nurse, had an honest look. And when we arrived, she nursed the little one, who threw herself on the breast with such quickness that it seemed to me that it was like a little starving baby who was dying of hunger," which essentially is what happened in this case. And then, of course, as soon as Zelie finds out about this, she immediately removes the child, takes her back into the home, and Marie continues. "Alas, it was already too late. She, Melanie, was too weak to recover, and soon she went to join the two little angels who had preceded her in heaven. Mama had so much pain over her death that whenever we went out for walks with her, she avoided walking on the side of the street, the Rue de la Barre, where little Thérèse had been with the nurse. She could never look at that street again." And actually, the reason why Thérèse was named Thérèse was because Zelie had lost her first Thérèse, and she wanted this child to be the Thérèse, to take her place. If you look at, excuse me, you can see the initials that Thérèse has put on all of these. We'll do them in order. The JL is Joseph Louis, the first of the boys. The M is, as I mentioned, Marie was given first in every case. Joseph Jean-Baptiste, and then Hélène, and then you can just see the MT there, Melanie Teres. And this is how Thérèse describes them and their dates at the bottom of it. And the title that she gives to them is this, in translation: "Remembrance of the brief exile." It's always how they looked at this life. This isn't our homeland. This is our exile. We're only here in passing. And our real homeland is awaits us. Remembrance of the brief exile of our beloved little souls and of their birth to heaven. In fact, Thérèse, at one point, you see this in the story of the soul, when she is, this is probably about 12, 13 at this point, and she is attacked by a severe case of scruples. And it just is burdening her, and she feels unable to find freedom from it. And then the thought comes to pray to these four brothers and sisters who are in heaven, and she's freed from it. And she always attributes that to the grace of their intercession. And this is where you also get that longing of all the family members for the day when we'll all be together, all 9 of us with our parents, and the suffering will be over. All right, this moves us now into the time of the Franco-Prussian War. And let's just pick up with the letters then. And you have the next letter on page 16. So this is written 7 weeks after the death of Melanie Teres. On the 22nd, so she's writing to Celine, her sister-in-law. On the 22nd of this month, we had a real alarm in Alençon. We were expecting the Prussians the next day, and nearly half the population of the town had left. I'd never seen such desolation. Everyone hid their valuables. I wasn't very afraid, and this is real. It's just the courage in this woman. Nothing frightens me anymore. If I'd wanted to flee, I would have gone straight to your house up to Lisieux, but my husband would have been very upset all alone, and I would have been very anxious. It was best to stay. In leaving Belém to go to Alençon, they passed by Mamers, which is about 20 miles away from Alençon. And then they turned off and went toward Le Mans. There were 20,000 of them. Now, this is another source of worry for Zelie, because her 2 oldest daughters are there in Le Mans at the boarding school of the Visitation Sisters. I'm very worried about my 2 little girls. People were saying there was heavy fighting being waged in Le Mans, and there was fighting there, and there was no way to go to them. Obviously, she wants to go and bring them home. The railroad was requisitioned by the troops, and we couldn't go by road because it was blocked by the enemy. Saturday morning, I received a letter from my sister, that's Elise, the visitation sister, telling me not to be alarmed, that the children were safer there than at home because the Prussians would never enter the convents. She said many women in the town had come to ask the nuns to take in their young girls. But the Prussians didn't stop in Le Mans. They want to head for Paris. What worried me most was that the authorities had decided that the town should put itself in a state of defense, and they called up the National Guard. They sent some into the forest, and now Louis gets involved in this. My husband went there Saturday morning and had to spend the night, but since there was no more danger, they made him relieve his post at night, so he returned around midnight. I'm worried and upset. However, I don't have as much reason to be as do many others, because in all probability, Louis won't leave, and my brother is even surer of staying, each for a different reason. I thank God for that, but it's still quite possible that they'll make men between the ages of 40 and 50 go, and Louis is 47 at this time. I'm almost expecting it. And then here's Louis. My husband is not worried about this at all. So he's 47. He's the father of a large family, and for that reason is unlikely to be called. And then Isidore runs a pharmacy, which is considered an essential service, and so he's unlikely. He's 29 at this point, but he also is unlikely to be called. So although Zelie is worried about this, she says, I'm less worried than many other women would be in this situation about their husbands and so forth. He would not ask, so this is Louis, he would not ask for any preferential treatment and often says that if he were free, he would soon join the Franc-Tireurs. Now, what this is, these were essentially guerrillas, and they would gather together and they'd be organized, and whatever weapons they had, and they would try to harass the enemy in any way that they could. It was a dangerous thing because when the Germans captured any of them, they would execute them. And so Louis is saying here that if he were free, if he didn't have his family, he would join them. Now, the financial issues, because of course, as the war is devastating France, economically things become critical for everyone as this is going on. And here you see that the family finances were not simply a peaceful thing throughout all the years that we're looking at. There were ups and downs. And at this point, as we'll see, Zelie doesn't even know if they're going to make it financially through, of course, the lace making business and the watch making business, both of these take a severe decline in the midst of all of this. And her brother Isidore is asking, he's struggling too, he's asking whether they can help him financially. And in fact, they would do this from time to time. They did help him out because his business eventually became successful, but he had his ups and downs with the pharmacy as well. There's one point in which Zelie says that if I didn't have my own family, and she says this to her brother, I would give you willingly everything that I have. My brother is asking if we would have any money available if he needs it. The time has passed. Let's get this. So here's where I've just put the figures so you can get a rough sense of what she means in these figures. The time has passed when I earned 8,000 to 10,000 francs a year. Now, if a franc at that time was roughly worth about $8, you can see that's a pretty substantial income that she's getting from that. But now that's not the case. And my husband also made a profit from the watchmaker shop. Now we can't even get money to live on. What's going to happen as we go through this war with everything collapsing? No one wants to pay their debts. I truly don't know what we'll do if this continues. We haven't touched the income, so they have some investments from the Crédit Foncier Bank, nor that of the railroads. And all the people who owe us money say they can't pay. So the lace making or the watchmaking, and people are just saying, we can't pay you. We're supposed to receive 7,000 francs in January from the sale of our houses on the Rue des Tisons. I'm still afraid that the woman who who has to come up with these funds won't be able to pay us. We're counting on this money to help you. If we could only have the 8,000 francs that are owed us from Paris, but I look upon this sum as lost. Madame D. Now, the reason why you see these letters rather than the name, because these people were still living when these letters were, people were showing interest, and they, in any case, they wanted to protect the identity of these persons. In some cases, the scholars have been able to identify who these people were. Madame D also owes us 1,000 francs and will never get it. She's destitute. Okay, 7 weeks later, now the war comes closer. I'm not sure if you know that the Prussians have been in our home since Monday morning at 7 o'clock. So they are still, it's about a year before they will move to the home where Thérèse will be born. And there again, there's the jewelry shop and the clockmaking shop. And the family lived here. Now, in the French terms, when you have the ground floor, first floor, and second floor. And that's how we understand that. What's essentially going to happen is that the German soldiers will take over the first floor, and the family has to move down. Basically, they're living in the shops while this is going on. I'm not sure if you know that the Prussians have been in our home since Monday morning at 7 o'clock. They marched in front of the house until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There were 25,000 of them. I couldn't describe our anxieties. What's going to happen with all of these victorious soldiers here? All the townspeople are appalled. Our poor soldiers went to fight against the Prussians, who were a league, little less than about 3 miles from the village. We heard the cannon on 3 different roads, the Mamere Road, the Aunay Road, and the road to Le Mans from 6 o'clock until 6 o'clock in the evening. It was pitiful to see our soldiers returning, some without feet, others without hands. I saw one with his face covered in blood. In the end, many of them were injured and all the mobile hospitals were full. We don't know how many are dead. Among them, there are a number of the Franc-Tireurs. And then she says to her sister-in-law, does it make sense when we have so few men to fight against the enemy to send them to slaughter like that against an army like this one we've seen with our own eyes? Monday around 3 o'clock, so you have 25,000 soldiers and they have to live they have to be housed somehow. And so they requisition the houses of the inhabitants. Monday around 3 o'clock, all the doors were marked with the number of enemy soldiers to be housed. A big sergeant came to ask us to inspect the house. I took him up to the first floor while telling him we have 4 children. Fortunately for us, he didn't try to go up to the second floor. You can just see that on the top of the screen there. Finally, they made us take in 9 of them, and we can't complain. In our part of town, small shopkeepers who have only 2 apartments are taking in 15, 20, and even 25. Those we have are neither mean nor looters. And note what she says here, but they love to eat like I have never seen. They eat everything without bread. Now, you would need somebody in the French culture to explain why that just really striking to her, that they eat without bread. Where is it here? This morning they asked for cheese. I bought a big one for them and they ate a quarter of it without even a mouthful of bread. They swallow mutton stew as if it were soup. You know, one of the things that happens, it's not in the letter here, at a certain point, Zelie notes that one of these soldiers is really suffering from homesickness, essentially, missing his family. And she notices this. And she speaks to him very kindly about this. She finds some special foods for him. And he was just very grateful for it, you know, that what she did. I'm not bothered by them. When they ask me for too much, I tell them that it's impossible. And there's the courage of the woman again. We want you to get us this. No, I can't do it. All right. This morning, they brought enough meat to feed 30 people and were in the process of having it cooked for them. We've had to let them have the entire first floor and move to the ground floor. If I told you everything, I'd have to write a book. The town refused to pay the amount they demanded, so they're also asking for financial indemnities. And we've been threatened by reprisals. All the livestock in the surrounding area were taken. Now there's no more milk anywhere. What will my little Celine, who is just a little shy of 2 years old, what will my little Celine do? She drinks a liter a day. And what are the poor mothers who have only small children going to do? Nor is there any meat in the butcher shops. In short, the town is in desolation. Everyone is crying except me. My husband is sad. He can neither eat nor sleep. I believe he's going to get sick. I forgot to tell you that at the beginning, during the bombing of the town, there was a wooden building site and many houses which were burned down. Shrapnel fell even on our street. A projectile smashed a storefront very close to us. We had to go down into the cellar. And this is the time when Leonie, who is this difficult and troubled child, she goes down to the cellar and she will not leave it. You know, she just can't deal with all the upheaval and the soldiers in the house and everything that's happening. Please write me as soon as possible. I'm worried about you because of the occupation of the country. And that's as much as Zelie says about the war in her letters, in these 2 letters that we have. The next letter, as you can see, moves us into the following year, 1872. So it's almost a year later. And in fact, after the war, there was a financial rebound in which things took on financially a whole new energy. And you get now the opposite problem, that she's overwhelmed with orders and so forth. So, and in this letter, we have our first mention of Thérèse, Saint Thérèse. I'm expecting my little angel any day now. And in fact, Thérèse will be born on January 2nd. This is December 25th, so it's just a few days away from her birth. And I'm very much at a loss because I still haven't found a wet nurse, and she knows that she's unlikely to be able to nurse Thérèse herself. In fact, she tries, but she's unable to do it. And so the wet nurse situation arises again. This is her 9th and final child. So wet nurses, and actually this was a widespread practice at the time. For many reasons, many women could be very burdened with large families and having to work and so forth. And it was a very difficult thing, you can just sense for everyone involved. And this is actually, I'm anticipating here, but this is the beginning of that great suffering in Thérèse, the need for a mother. Because like a number of her brothers and sisters, she begins to bond with Zelie, but then Zelie finds that she can't nourish her child as she needs, and she leaves the home with Rose, bonds with her. A year later, loses her second mother, so to speak, when she returns home, bonds with Zelie, and that's where you get this in Thérèse. You remember that how she describes, and Zelie talks about it in her letters, when Thérèse is home now and she's walking down the stairs, and at every step she calls out for her mother, and unless her mother answers, Thérèse will not take the next step. And she's lost already 2 mothers, so to speak. And then Zelie dies when Thérèse is 4, and she loses that mother. She chooses Pauline as her mother, and in a way that's very painful for her. Pauline, it's one of these things, what do? You know, Pauline knew that her departure for the Carmel was going to be very hard for Thérèse, and not wanting to cause her pain, just didn't say anything to her about it. And she finds out in a way that's very painful for her, because she overhears a conversation between Marie and Pauline, which lets her know that Pauline is going to leave for the Carmel, and it's like being pierced by an arrow. Another mother is leaving me, and I didn't even know it. This is one of the reasons why she grew to love Mary so much, because Mary was the one mother who never left her. That's a deep thread in Thérèse. I'm always struck as I speak about Thérèse by how often I use the word deep. And it's right, because there are wonderful depths in her. Well, in any case, this is a few days before her birth. And Zelie is looking to find a wet nurse. I've seen several of them, but they didn't suit me perfectly. And my husband has never been able to make up his mind and choose one. It's not because of the cost. It's because we're afraid of bringing someone into our home who's not very suitable, as are generally all the wet nurses today. If God gives me the grace of being able to nurse my child, it will be nothing but a pleasure to raise her. And this is the letter where she speaks about children. As for me, I love children unto folly. I was born to have them. She's 41 years old, but it will soon be time for that to be over. I'll be 41 years old, the 23rd of this month, old enough to be a grandmother. And the next letter is written the day after Therese's birth. I think this is a good point for us just to see some photos of the 5 Martin children. So and of course they're all girls, as we know. So there's Marie as a young girl, and as she grows, she was the one, as I mentioned, that her father called the diamond. She stood her ground, and a little bit later, there's Pauline, 1 year younger, as a young girl. And then later, as I've mentioned, when you get to know Pauline, your heart really warms to her. There's a goodness, and she was very capable. You can note that both she and her older sister were in the Carmel, but it was Pauline who was chosen to be the prioress. And she always had that kind of leader's quality, and not in any harsh way. She could be very warm. Eventually, what happened was after the explosion of interest in Thérèse, when the Carmel in Lisieux was being deluged with letters and requests, and eventually, when Pauline at one point was re-elected prioress, the Holy Father stepped in and named her prioress for life, because she was obviously the right person to handle all of this. And so she remained prioress for the rest of her religious life. And then here's the third daughter, Leonie, and she is the one who is so difficult for Zelie. They send her to try to study as a student with some sisters in Alençon. It goes so badly, the sisters send her home. They make 2 attempts to send her to the Visitation School together with Marie and Pauline and their aunt. And to Zelie's great sorrow, again, she is so disruptive that the first time she's only after 2 months they send her home. The second time after 6 months they send her home. And so Zelie just doesn't know what to do with this child. This is the look she would have for the rest of her life. Celine is the 4th of the 5 daughters, 4 years older than Thérèse, and she would be the inseparable companion of Thérèse, as you know if you've read the story of a soul. Celine at 12 years and as a young woman. There you see both Celine and Leonie, and she is posing here as a painter. She was the best artist of the sisters. A number of them would do things like crafting and writing poems and so forth, and painting, but she was the best. In fact, the first images of Thérèse, if you go back and look at the first publications of the story of a soul, they're all paintings of Celine, of Thérèse. She did a number of them. This is a sideline, but I did a retreat years ago for a community of Carmelite sisters of the aged and infirm. They have hospices, homes for elderly people. And in their chapel, they have an enormous painting that Celine did of Thérèse. It's taller than I am. It's just a great thing. And then here's Thérèse at 3. And the reason, as Zelie says, that she looks so almost sad there is that she was frightened of the photographer. They couldn't get her to smile. You see the 4 years difference there. Thérèse at 8. That's where, you remember when she goes to see the bishop and tries to look as old as she can? She does that with her hair. Since we're on them, let's look at, this is their first cousin, Jeanne, so Celine Guérin's daughter. And this is at a little older age than we saw before. We saw them in their first years. And this is her husband, Dr. Francis Lanel. So she is the only one, as I mentioned, who marries of these cousins. And this doctor actually would be involved in Thérèse's final illness. And there's her sister, Marie. Here is, so this is the time when 3 of the sisters are in the Carmel. Leonie is back home again after yet another failure to enter religious life. At this point, she's, depending on the exact year, she has failed probably twice at this point. There is Jeanne, their first cousin, and there's Leonie. There's Marie, their first cousin, and the elderly woman here is Celine Guérin's mother. And there is Jeanne's husband, Francis, the doctor. The next is Isidore, their uncle, a priest visiting, and then Celine, their Zelie's sister-in-law. Leonie, Celine, and their cousin Marie. This is a nice little thing. At a certain point, Louis got this dog, and they named him Tom, a spaniel, and got this dog for Thérèse. And you'll actually see him in a lot of the photographs. But there's a lovely thing that happens when the family finally has to leave Les Buissonets, the home where Thérèse has been raised in Lisieux, because the family now is no longer a family living together. Part of the furniture and the belongings there, they sent to the Carmel, for the use of the sisters. And what happens is the workmen are driving the cart, taking the possessions from the family home over to the Carmel, and the dog follows them. And when they open the door to the Carmel, the dog just slips through and runs in, and he finds Thérèse and heads right to Thérèse and is just making, the way the dogs do when they're really happy. It's just, Thérèse never mentions that, but it must have been a lovely moment for her when that happened. This is Louis now in the time of his illness. And this is the time, this is Celine, and this is a couple that they hired to help take care of their father because just physically they weren't able. And then Leonie. So at this point, his legs are paralyzed. If you know his story, he suffers a mental illness. At least one medical account supposes that this was arterial sclerosis, and there's a whole history behind how this happens. And this is a searingly painful trial for Thérèse and her sisters to see their father, whom they love so much, in this condition. But at this point, his legs are paralyzed, so there's no fear that because he began to do this, he would just disappear, and nobody knew how to find him. But at this point, he cannot move, and so it's safe for him to return home. And Celine and Leonie are dedicated at this point to taking care of their father. This is the time when Celine really shines. She really comes to the fore because she's the one that carries all of this. And Thérèse, that you have a number of letters that Thérèse writes to encourage her during this time. I'll also add that this, call it wheelchair, is the same one. They gave it to the Carmel after their father's death. And when you see Thérèse in something like this, in her illness, it's this very one that her father had used. Marie, again, their first cousin, Leonie. In the background, the couple that were helping them, Celine with her father, Isidore, Celine, the sister-in-law, and a friend of the family. Isidore, Zelie, Leonie, Marie, and Thérèse, Celine. There are 3 Celines in this story, and so you have to keep them clear. All right, finally, let's just look at these same sisters in religious life. So this is Pauline, who took the name of Sister Agnes of Jesus, and as I mentioned, was prioress for many years. I'm just going to give these in the order of their entrance into Carmel. Marie, who is 1 year older and takes the name of Sister Marie of the Sacred Heart. Thérèse, whom we know as Sister Thérèse, Saint now Thérèse of the Child Jesus, but that's not her full name. Her full name, she adds the second piece to it a few years after her entrance. And so she's Sœur Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus et de la Sainte Face, Sister Thérèse of the Child Jesus and of the Holy Face. And the Holy Face for Thérèse is the face of Jesus as we see it in Isaiah 53. You know, one from whom there was no beauty in him, one from whom we turn our eyes. So what you get in Thérèse, if to really understand Thérèse, you need to see both parts of this name. And in fact, she will say toward the end of her life that this has become the central part of her life because she goes through so much suffering. So there you get the beauty and the simplicity of the child, but here you get the hidden suffering, wounded face of Christ, which she turns to in her own suffering. To see Thérèse, you really need to see both, and really above all, the second piece. And then their cousin, Marie, as I think I mentioned yesterday, also enters the Carmel, and she takes the name Sister Marie of the Eucharist. Marie, this Marie is another very, you like her if you read her letters. In fact, in Thérèse's illness, Marie's letters are valuable probably because her father was a pharmacist. She is able to describe what Thérèse undergoes in a way that's very valuable for understanding it. And then finally, the last to enter is Celine, because she remains at home to take care of their father until his death, and then enters the Carmel. And her name, after some changes, becomes Sister Genevieve of Saint Teresa. After the death of Pauline, she would become the prioress of the Carmel. And here is a photo that shows you all 5 of them in the Carmel. So here is Marie, Pauline, Celine, Thérèse, and then their cousin Marie. You see all 5 of them there in the Carmel. And then the other who does not enter the Carmel is Leonie, and she enters the Visitation. 3 times she attempts to enter religious life, and 3 times she's unable to do it, and she's sent home. And she attributed always to Thérèse, because this takes place after the death of Thérèse. She makes a final attempt to enter religious life. And there's a beautiful thing there. When she goes in the Carmel, the Visitation Monastery, she says, "I will not leave here except in my coffin." She didn't even leave that way because she's still buried there in the chapel, but now accessible to people because so many people want to pray to her. And then there's, I wanted to include this photo because this is one of these things where I say to myself, only God can do things like this. So you have the 3 sisters in the Carmel in Lisieux, and of course they're never going to leave there. And then you have Leonie in the Visitation, which is roughly, say, 30 miles away, which was quite a distance at the time. We have one description of a priest going from the Carmel in Lisieux to the Visitation in Caen, and it takes him about 3 hours to get there. And of course, Leonie is not, so here's Pauline. Let's see who these are, they're older now. This, and it's so fuzzy. My guess is that this is Marie and that's Celine, and that certainly is Leonie. And so they never expect that they're ever going to see each other again. And that's that longing for, when exile will be over and we'll be together again. But what happens is that the cause of canonization of Thérèse begins and it moves. In 1910, you have the depositions of the witnesses for her beatification. And so, of course, the sisters in Lisieux give their witness. And Leonie is taken to the residence of the bishop in Bayeux, and she gives her testimony there. But when it comes time for the testimonies for her canonization, so we're now in 1915, she would be beatified in 1923 and canonized in 1925. So in 1915, you have a second round of depositions with a view now to her canonization and the process in Rome. And what those charged, so there's a small committee of priests that is charged with taking these depositions. They note that almost all of the witnesses are in Lisieux and that Leonie alone is at a distance in Caen. And so they decide that rather than, it would just be simpler for everyone if Leonie were to come to the Carmel and give her witness there. And what happens then is that, and this photo is taken of this time, they have 8 days together in the Carmel. And it's really a turning point in the life of Leonie because she is deeply, deeply imbibing Thérèse through when she read the story of a soul, it just taught her many things about her, because she wasn't in the Carmel like the others. And she learned things about her sister that she'd never known. And of course, Thérèse writes about her. And again, this, as I say, you jump into the sea of the Martin family, you never finish. It would be beautiful to go through the letters of Thérèse to her sister. Those are marvelous things. And Chris and I did that when we went through the podcast. So if you want more on Leonie than we can possibly do here, I would recommend listening to that series of podcasts on Leonie, where you'll get her whole story. But they spend these 8 days together, and the Carmelite sisters do many lovely things. In the refectory, they have Leonie sit in the seat where Thérèse sat, and they just many different things like this. Leonie, at one point when I was reading her letters, I wrote this sentence for myself: it's not that you have gratitude, you are gratitude. Read her letters and you'll just see it. She never ceases to marvel at the love that she's shown, and she sees herself as so, at least she did until the things begin to change, as so poor and humble and little. And when she love is shown to her like this, she just can't get over it. And read her letters sometimes and look at the vocabulary. It's all heart level and it's all warm if you read it. So these were like 8 days of heaven for her and for the others who never dreamed that they would ever see her again. Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. Go on at length about that. There was some thought that maybe they would go down to Rome for the canonization, and they would be together again. But the sisters, and they could have gone. The permission was given, but they opted not to be there. They just didn't want to get caught up in that. They were contemplatives. They would stay in their monasteries. This is Leonie in the last years of her life. We owe this photograph to World War II. At this point, the Germans, this is 1941, have taken France, and this is for documentation and so forth, but it's lovely that we have it. You can see a woman who is content. Yeah, her story is beautiful. Okay, we don't need those pictures, I guess. Since they're up here. This is where they went to the sea. I mentioned that the first evening, the Guérin family would rent. This is at low tide, so that's why it doesn't look very attractive. Here's a painting from 1875 where you see it a little better. And they would go to the sea. That's where Thérèse had her experience of the sea. This is the Visitation Convent in Le Mans. 34 miles distant, Zelie writing her letters. Let's stop there and go back to the letters for the few minutes that we have left. just because it comes to mind. The reason why we have these photographs of Thérèse in the monastery and the sisters, convents generally would not have had cameras or anything like that, was because Celine, who was so enterprising, amongst many other things, got into photography. And so she had a camera. You know how you'd see the photographer underneath the whatever you call that, the curtain or whatever it was. And all of that equipment to develop the photos, she had that. And when she entered the Carmel, she brought that with her. And she's the one that took these pictures, which is why we have them. Okay, so the next letter here is Therese's birth. My little girl was born last night, January 2nd, Thursday at 11:30. She's very strong and in very good health. They tell me she weighs 8 pounds, let's say 6, which is still not bad. She seems very sweet. I'm very happy. It's just nice to see Zelie say that in a letter. However, at first I was surprised. I was so sure I was having a boy. I'd been imagining this for 2 months because I could feel she was much stronger than my other children. I barely suffered a half hour. What I felt before was practically nothing. Excuse me. You can just see as she goes through these various trials, she's just growing in strength. Let's see. She'll be baptized tomorrow, Saturday. The only thing missing to make the celebration complete is all of you. Marie is going to be the godmother, as she was. I received your letter, and you'll see this every year. The custom was to give gifts, some gifts for Christmas, but also New Year's. And so every year, Celine Guérin, her sister-in-law, sends gifts to the Martin girls. And every year, Zelie responds in the same way. Thank you, I'm so grateful, but you shouldn't have done it. It was too much. I received your letter as well as the box containing the New Year's gifts. I don't know if I should scold you. I want to very much, yet I also want to thank you, but everything is too beautiful and too expensive. Celine wore her beautiful fur and muff for the first time on the first day of the year. I wish all of you a happy new year. Please remember me to Monsieur and Madame Fournet, so that's Celine's parents, and Monsieur and Madame Modelonde, that's Celine's sister who is married, and that's her name as in marriage. All right, the next is 2 weeks later. I'm completely recovered now. The little one, Thérèse, is also doing well. She promises to be very strong, but nevertheless, I don't dare count on it. I'm always afraid of enteritis, which caused the death of her first boy and probably was involved in the second as well. I had begun to breastfeed her, and fearing that this was not enough, I wanted to help by giving her a bottle. This worked very well until Sunday, but the famous bottle spoiled everything. It was impossible to make her go back to breastfeeding. I tried everything. I let her fast, but she cried so pitifully, I had to give in. My little one is not at all difficult during the day, but at night she often makes us pay dearly for her good day. Last night I held her until 11:30. I was exhausted and couldn't do it anymore. Fortunately, afterward, she didn't do anything but sleep, and now she explains the name. This child is named Thérèse, like my last little girl. Everyone tells me that she'll be beautiful. She already laughs. I saw this for the first time on Tuesday. Now, how old is she at this point? This is January 16th. She's 2 weeks old. I thought I was mistaken, but yesterday it was impossible to doubt it any longer. She looked at me very careful, then gave me a delightful smile. And then this. While I was carrying her, I noticed something that never happened with my other children. When I sang, she would sing with me. I'm confiding this to you. No one would believe it. Okay, letter the next day asking her brother Isidore's advice about how to care for Thérèse. I'm extremely worried about my little Thérèse. I'm afraid she has an intestinal illness. I noticed the same alarming symptoms as those of my other children who died. Must I lose this one too? Tell me how I should feed her, if the bread water with half milk is suitable. All she's been doing is sleeping this morning for 3.5 hours. I don't know if it's the weakness that causes this sleepiness, and I'm very anxious. As for me, I barely sleep more than 2 hours because I'm almost constantly around the little one, who for some time has been very restless a good part of the night. If you can write me and encourage me with your advice, that would make me very happy because I need it so much. And let's just read one more letter here. So this is 2 months later, and she tells her sister-in-law what's been happening. Since I wrote to you, I've had so much trouble. My little girl became worse and worse. Last Sunday, I sent for another doctor, Dr. Balak. He came about 5 o'clock in the evening. After examining the baby, he asked me what I had been giving her. I told him what I'd been doing. He thought that this was good, but not enough to nourish her in the weak state that she was in. He thinks that one can feed a baby without milk for 2 or 3 days, but not more. And for 2 weeks, she didn't take anything but barley water almost without milk, and for 2 days, gruel water without milk. Finally, he said to me, and this doctor really saved Therese's life, this child must be breastfed right away. That's the only thing that can save her. I didn't know what to do because I couldn't think of feeding her myself, and I didn't have any wet nurse in mind. I explained my dilemma to him, and he gave me a prescription. Twice a day, I had to give her a spoonful of rice water and one of lime water in 2 spoonfuls of milk. When I saw the prescription, I said to myself, my little girl is lost. She won't be able to tolerate 2/3 milk in the state she's in. Madame Leriche, who is the wife of Louis' nephew, Adolphe, came to see me last night. She was so shaken that she went to bed without eating dinner and could only cry. She looked at her child and said, if he were in that state, I would die. Finally, that night, I was looking for a way to find a wet nurse at all costs when I remembered a woman I know very well and who suits me in every respect. And this is where Rose Taillé comes into the story again. Can I go for just a few more minutes? Okay. It was 7 o'clock, so it's in the evening when she thinks of Rose. So she now goes to see the doctor, and I left to go to the doctor's house. I spoke to him about the wet nurse who's been nursing her child for 1 year. So she's been nursing her own 1-year-old child, and the question is, will she be able at this point to nurse Thérèse? He thought about it a little and said to me, you must hire her right away. She's the only option we have now to save your baby. And if this doesn't save her, at least you'll have nothing to reproach yourself for. If it hadn't been so late, I would have left that moment to go and get the wet nurse. The night seemed long to me. The little one almost didn't want to drink. All the gravest signs that preceded the death of my other little angels were present, and I was very sad, convinced that the poor darling wouldn't take the breast given her weak state, so that even if Rose comes, it may be that Thérèse will just be too weak to breastfeed. So at daybreak, I left to go to the wet nurse who lives in Saint-Maillet, almost two leagues, 5-6 miles away. So again, early morning, and she walks that road from Alençon. My husband was away, and I didn't want to entrust the success of my mission to anyone else. On a deserted country road, I met 2 men who frightened me, but I said to myself, even if they killed me, it wouldn't matter. I had death in my soul. Finally, I arrived at the wet nurse's house and asked her if she would come with me right away to live with us full time. Now, obviously, that's not going to be possible because she has her own children. She told me she couldn't leave her children and her house, but she would stay with us a week and then take the little one home with her, which is what happens. I agreed, knowing that my baby would do very well in her home. This woman had already cared for one of my children, actually for 2 of them. We left together after a half hour and arrived home at 10:30. The maid said to me I wasn't able to make her drink. She doesn't want to take anything. The wet nurse looked at the child and shook her head with an expression that seemed to say, I made this trip for nothing. I quickly went upstairs to my room. I knelt at the feet of St. Joseph and asked him for mercy, that the little one be cured, resigning myself completely to the will of God if he wanted to take her. I don't cry often, but I cried while I was praying. I didn't know if I should go downstairs. So here's the Rose attempting to breastfeed the child. Should I go down and see, is the child feeding or not? And she, finally, I decided to go. And what did I see? The child was suckling with all her heart. She didn't let go of her hold until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So they get home at 10:30. Once Thérèse begins to breastfeed, it's about 10:30 to 1 that she just won't stop. She threw up a few mouthfuls and fell against her wet nurse as if she were dead. There were 5 of us around her. We were all stunned. There was a worker, this is one of her lace-making workers, who was crying. As for me, my blood froze. The child had no visible breath. We bent down to try and find some sign of life, but it was no use. We saw nothing, but she was so calm, so peaceful, that I thank God for having let her die so gently. Finally, a quarter of an hour passed. My little Thérèse opened her eyes and began to smile. From that moment on, she was completely cured. Her healthy appearance returned, as well as her cheerfulness. Since then, everything is better. But my poor little one has left, and this would be 13 months. It's very sad to have raised a child for 2 months and then have to entrust her to strangers' hands. What consoles me is knowing that God wants it this way. That's always the bedrock for her, since I did everything I could to raise her myself. So I have nothing to reproach myself for in this regard. I would really have preferred to keep the wet nurse at my house, as would my husband. He didn't want the others, but he very much wanted this one. He knows her to be an excellent woman. I'd say the whole church owes a lot to this Rose, the wonderful woman that she was. You'll think of this what you want, but I hope with all my heart that you never have a child in this state. You don't know what to do or how to handle it. You're afraid of not giving her the right thing. It's a continual death. You'd have to go through it to know what a torture it is. I don't know if purgatory is worse than this. Well, here's another hard trial that's over. So very much a hard trial, but this time things work out in the way that we know.
The Blessed Mother, the dying of a child, waiting, and then the resurrection of a child, and that her, and it was just the smallest, but then also the fathers allowed it, and that trust that, okay, it's for the greater good, and look what happened. Oh, well, so much to ponder, right? For those in our webinar, this will be the conclusion of this particular presentation. And we hope that you'll be able to take some time to be able to absorb and reflect and look in the reflection questions found in the back of the handout that you were given. And we look forward. Well, first, before we let them go, would you have thoughts that you would give them to maybe ponder, Father Gallagher, and this particular group as well?
Pete, just what I said yesterday, just listen to your heart and toward what is it drawn, what speaks to you, what maybe stands out for you in some way as we've gone through this part of the story. And then just let the Lord be there with the Lord. Let the Lord speak to that.
You've been viewing Hope in Difficult Times with St. Therese and her family with Father Timothy Gallagher. To hear and or to download audio recordings from this retreat and so much more from Father Gallagher, visit discerninghearts.com, or you can find them in the free Discerning Hearts app. You can also view other teachings conducted by Father Gallagher by checking out the various playlists listed below. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts. We hope that if this has been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission, which is to offer rock-solid and authentic spiritual formation freely to souls around the world. And if you feel us worthy, please consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax-deductible, to help support our efforts. But most of all, we hope that you will tell a friend about Discerning Hearts and join us next time for Hope in Difficult Times with St. Therese and her family with Father Timothy Gallagher.